Hello, Mr. Salavati. My name is Amandeep Pabla. Over the last few days, I've been reading The Wars by Timothy Finley. The Wars is about a 19-year-old boy, Robert Ross, who decides to go to war to avoid the guilt of his sister's death. He believes he is the one responsible for her death. The idea first crosses his mind when at the funeral he sees his other sister's beau, in uniform. Finley describes it as, "He stood at attention. Robert envied him because he could go away when this was over and surround himself with space. It was then perhaps that first inkling came to him that it was time for Robert to join the army. But he didn't think it consciously. Once Robert does enlist himself, he experiences harsh circumstances and meets people that change his perspective on life, both negatively and positively. Two people that changed his life positively are Harris and Rodwell. Harris is Robert's best friend in the army. They quickly became friends before they even started. Robert was the only one for Harris when he was on his deathbed and cared for him every day. Another person who changed Robert's life positively is Rodwell. Rodwell often reminded Robert of his sister who died because of their love for animals and their sensitive nature. Somebody who impacted Robert's life negatively would be Captain Leather. He is selfish and cruel and does not care about anybody but himself and politics. Personally, I enjoyed how Finley shows different perspectives on the war. Not only does he show Robert a soldier's perspective, he also shows the family scene once he leaves. In our review, I found, war is described as, it tears apart their family, turns them into killers, forces them to commit acts of depravity. I also found it interesting how some characters experience mental health problems due to the war. Some of these characters are Mrs. Ross, Captain Taffler, Levitt, and Robert. During the years that the wars was set in, mental health was not explored as much as it is today. In fact, it has come a long way. In 500 to 1500 AD, people characterized with abnormal behavior were said to be possessed by demons if it was physical, or possessed by witches if it was spiritual. The treatments they had back then were to spray them with holy water, exorcism, burning alive, and prayers. Moving on to the time period of 1500 to 1700 AD, asylums were created to house the mentally ill. They were not hospitals, but more like madhouses, where troubled people were removed from society. Also, for a small fee, the patients were put on display for the public to watch. Treatments at this time were very aggressive and violent. They used intimidation to try to make patients choose rationality over insanity. Some of the treatments include bleeding and blistering, electrical shocks, and physical restraints. Now moving on to the 19th to 20th century. That would be when the book was set. This is the beginning of the scientific view of abnormal behavior, the time when they established a link between the brain and mental health illnesses. There are many new treatments that came during this time. For example, psychoanalysis that was inspired by Freud, behavior modification, conditioning of learning, improved drug therapy, hospitals and institutions, and scientific exploration of mental illnesses. The characters I mentioned earlier would have been diagnosed with different mental illnesses if they were living in this time period. To start off with, Mrs. Ross would be diagnosed with depression as well as Captain Taffler. The definition of depression is a mood or emotional state that is marked by feelings of low self-worth or guilt and a reduced ability to enjoy life. Some symptoms shown by both the characters are angry outbursts, trouble concentrating, feeling worthless, and addictions. For Mrs. Ross, this can be seen when she tells her son, the last thing she ever tells her son, "I know what you want to do. I know you're going to go away and be a soldier. Well, you can go to hell. I'm not responsible. I'm just another stranger. Birth I can give you, but life I cannot. I can't keep anyone alive, not anymore." In this quote, she could also be talking about her brother who was murdered a couple of years ago, before she got married. To anyone else, it may seem that she is a bitter person, but because of her experiences in her life, it makes sense to why she would say something like this to her son before he went off. Also, it is clear that she's addicted to alcohol. It's kind of like a way for her to get relief from her life. Another character who goes through depression is Captain Taffler. He is a prestigious soldier who went to war twice. The first time he went, he was wounded, got sent back for treatment, and decided he wanted to go back again. The second time, both of his arms are blown off, and he decides that his life is not worth living anymore, and tries to commit suicide. Finley describes the scene as, "He was kneeling on the floor in a pool of unraveled bandage with his forehead touching the stones. One of the walls was covered with great wide stripes of red at shoulder height, where he must have been rubbing his wounds to make them bleed. The stumps where his arms had been were raw, and one of them was pumping blood in spurts across the floor." As you can see, Captain Taffler decided to end his life in a painful way, but it was unsuccessful as somebody stopped him in time. Some statistics about major depression in Canada now are that 11% of men and 16% of women will experience major depression at some point in their lives, from Health Canada. Some treatments available for anybody experiencing these symptoms now are psychotherapy, cognitive therapy, and drugs. In some severe cases, hospitalization may need to happen. Another mental illness characters experienced is post-traumatic stress disorder. Levitt and Robert Ross suffered from this illness. The definition of post-traumatic stress disorder is classified as an exposure to trauma involving death or the threat of death, serious injury, or sexual violence. The definition of a trauma is any emotional response when an injury overwhelms someone. It affects the way you feel, it affects your body, ability to satisfy relationships, the way you think, and the way you behave. There isn't any real cause of PTSD, but it is linked to factors like the length of time the trauma lasted and the number of traumatic experiences, as well as the person's reaction to the event and the support they received following the event. For Levitt, the traumatic experience was when the dugout collapsed. It is described as, "Levitt, who in fact was suffering from shock, stood quite still for a moment, looking about the half-collapsed dugout. Instead of getting the support he needed, Levitt was yelled at and, in fact, struck when he did not compromise. After that, he was sent to train with wounded soldiers, which is not the support he needed as he was not physically wounded but mentally wounded." Another character, Robert Ross, the main character, experienced PTSD after his sister's death. He became a changed person. The day she died, it says, it was Robert's fault. Robert was her guardian and he was locked in his bedroom, making love to his pillows. Because of his carelessness, his sister died, and that will forever be in Robert's heart. Throughout his journey in the war, he is reminded of her and all the pain he has caused to his family. Some symptoms that both the characters show are distressed memories, upsetting dreams, lack of sleep, avoiding things that remind you of the event, difficulty maintaining relationships, and aggressive behavior. In fact, a study done by the Parliament of Canada shows that 30% of all combat soldiers on the front line suffer from PTSD. Also, 60% of veterans injured in war after the Veterans Act of 2007 suffered from PTSD. Some treatments for this illness are counseling, medication, and support groups, all things that weren't offered to Levitt or Robert Ross during their time. Overall, I think Timothy Finley touched on points that were often ignored in the First World War. He showed how it is not a positive thing and how it affects people and their families. Not only does it cause physical pain, it also caused mental and emotional trauma. All things I would have not known as I am a child that has not grown up in war. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope that it gave you a reason to look at the novel in a different perspective.